Life has a funny way of putting you in situations you'd never expect. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary, just a job to pay the bills. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. When I saw the listing for an animal caretaker, I thought, why not? I've always liked animals. They don't judge, they don't argue, they just exist. At the time, things were tight. Rent was overdue. My fridge looked like a barren wasteland, and my phone buzzed with friendly reminders about bills. You've been there, right? Desperate times call for quick decisions, and this seemed simple enough. Feed the animals, keep their spaces clean, and clock out. No degree required, no previous experience necessary. Perfect. When I called the number, I expected a bored receptionist or a robotic voicemail, but instead, I got this deep, calm voice. "We've been looking for someone like you," the man said. "Not someone willing, not someone available, but someone like me." Strange, right? I brushed it off. The guy asked if I could meet him at the facility later that night. Yes, night. That should have been my first red flag. But I'm a night owl, always have been. Nights are quiet, peaceful, my kind of vibe. So I didn't think twice about it. The facility, as he called it, was tucked away at the edge of town. No signs, no big gates, nothing that screamed official. It looked more like an old warehouse with a few lights flickering outside. My first thought was, did I just sign up for some shady underground gig? But again, desperate times. I parked my car, took a deep breath, and stepped out. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even when you know you're alone. The building smelled like damp wood and metal, a mix of old and forgotten things. Inside, it wasn't much better. Dim lights lined the hallways, casting long shadows on the walls. I half expected rats to scurry past me. Instead, there was a small reception desk, and behind it sat a man in his 50s, wearing a plain gray uniform. His name tag read, Mr. Harland. He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his piercing eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt like I'd walked into something bigger than myself. But he smiled, an odd, almost forced smile, and motioned for me to sit. "So, you're here for the caretaker position?" His voice was calm but had this weight to it, like he was testing me with every word. I nodded, trying to act cool, but my hands were clenched so tightly in my lap I thought they might leave marks. He explained the job. Feed the animals twice a night, clean up their spaces if needed, and make sure all enclosures were secure. Simple enough. "And the animals?" I asked. "What kind are we talking about?" He paused. It wasn't a long pause, but it felt heavy, like he was deciding whether or not to answer. "Exotic," he said finally. "Rare. You won't find these in any zoo." That should have been my second red flag, but curiosity got the better of me. Plus, I wasn't exactly in a position to be picky. "Sounds interesting," I said, trying to sound casual. Mr. Harland leaned forward, folding his hands on the desk. "One thing you should know, we have rules here. Follow them no matter what. If you can't, this job isn't for you." "Rules?" Sure, every job has rules, right? But the way he said it didn't feel like he was talking about safety regulations or company policies. It felt personal. "Got it," I said, though I wasn't sure I did. "Good," he said, sliding a small notebook across the desk. "Your shift starts tomorrow night. Read this before then. Memorize it." I flipped through the notebook later that night in my car, and that's when I started to feel uneasy. The rules weren't normal. Don't look directly into their eyes. If one of them speaks, don't respond. And the last one, never, ever open the red door. My stomach twisted. This was no ordinary job. But by then, it was too late. I was in. The next night, I drove back to the facility. It was quiet just like before, but now I felt different, less confident. That little notebook sat in the passenger seat, and I'd read through it more times than I wanted to admit. The rules. They weren't just instructions, they felt like warnings. Here's a taste of what I'm talking about. If the lights in the main hallway flicker, stop walking and wait for them to stabilize. Do not look behind you. Ignore any knocking on the door during feeding rounds. No matter how loud or desperate it sounds, if you hear a growl, hum softly. Keep humming until it stops. Never, under any circumstance, open the red door. At first, I thought, okay, this has to be a joke. It read more like something out of a horror movie than a job manual. But then I remembered Mr. Harlan's face. Calm, serious, like he wasn't messing around. Still, I tried to convince myself it was just some over-the-top safety policy. You know, the kind of thing they add to scare off people who aren't serious about the job. But deep down, something didn't sit right. When I arrived, the place looked just as eerie as the night before. The lights outside still flickered, and the shadows they cast seemed to stretch longer than they should. As I walked inside, I noticed the air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in on me. Mr. Harland was already waiting at the front desk. This time, he wasn't smiling. "You read the rules?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah," I said, holding up the notebook. "And they're different," I admitted. He tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Different isn't the word I'd use. They're important. Memorize them. Stick to them. You'll be fine." I nodded, but my throat felt tight. I wanted to ask why these rules existed, what they were really about, but something in his expression told me not to push. Instead, I asked, "What happens if you don't follow them?" His face didn't change. He just said, "You don't want to find out." Mr. Harland led me through the main hallway, where the enclosures were. The smell of damp metal and something earthy filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt wrong, somehow, like the kind of scent that lingered in places it shouldn't. We passed the first enclosure, and I couldn't see much through the foggy glass. Just a faint silhouette, something big with long limbs and a hunched back. My instinct was to slow down and get a better look, but Mr. Harlan's hand shot out, motioning me to keep walking. "Don't linger," he said, not even glancing at the enclosure. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. That's when I noticed the red door at the end of the hallway. It looked ordinary enough, wooden with chipped paint and a rusted handle. But something about it made my skin crawl. "That's the red door," he said, his voice lower now. "You know the rule." I nodded quickly, not trusting myself to say anything. The rest of the tour was just as unsettling. Mr. Harland explained the feeding process. Each enclosure had a small metal slot where you'd slide the food tray through. Never open the main door. Never stick your hand in. And if you ever hear anything unusual, growling, scratching, or even voices, step away and wait. "What kind of animals are these?" I asked again, hoping this time he'd give me a straight answer. "Exotic," he repeated, his tone making it clear that was all I was getting. He handed me a keyring, each one marked with a number that matched an enclosure. Then, he looked me dead in the eye and said, "Stick to the rules, and you'll get through your shift just fine." I tried to act casual as I nodded, but my mind was racing. Why all the secrecy? Why all the rules? And why did I feel like I was being watched every time I stepped near one of the enclosures? When Mr. Harland left, I stood alone in the main hallway, clutching the keys like they were a lifeline. The place was quiet, too quiet. No animals making noise, no hum of machinery, just the faint buzz of the overhead lights. I decided to start with the first enclosure, the one with the foggy glass. The slot for the food tray was cold and slightly damp when I touched it. I slid the tray through, half expecting to hear something, maybe a grunt or the sound of claws on metal, but there was nothing. I took a step back, waiting, but nothing moved. As I turned to head to the next enclosure, I heard it. A soft knock coming from somewhere behind me. I froze. It wasn't loud, just faint, like someone gently tapping on a door. The rules flashed in my mind. Ignore any knocking. I told myself it was probably just the pipes or the building settling. Old places make noises, right? But the knocking came again, 3 short, deliberate taps. I clenched my fists and kept walking, my steps quicker now. By the time I reached the second enclosure, my heart was pounding. I slid the tray through and stepped back, half expecting another sound. Instead, I felt a cold draft brush past me, even though the air was still. As I finished the first round of feeding, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The notebook rules swirled in my mind, each one a thread pulling tighter around my nerves. I hadn't broken any rules, but the night was far from over. For the first hour, nothing happened. It was almost boring. The animals stayed quiet, the halls were still, and I started to think I'd overhyped everything in my head. Maybe the rules were just a precaution, a way to keep the workers alert. I mean, think about it. Don't look behind you? Don't open a door? It all felt a little ridiculous in the bright glow of the hallway lights. So I let myself relax just a bit. Big mistake. I was midway through my second round of feeding when it started. I had just finished with enclosure 3, sliding the tray through the slot, when the lights in the hallway flickered. Not a subtle flicker, but a sudden, almost angry burst, as if the bulbs were struggling to stay alive. My heart skipped. The rules flashed in my mind. If the lights flicker, stop walking and wait. Do not look behind you. I froze where I stood, gripping the keyring so hard it bit into my palm. The hallway went dark for what felt like forever. I could hear the faint hum of the electricity trying to kick back on, but all I could think about was that second part of the rule. Don't look behind you. I told myself it was nothing, just faulty wiring, maybe a storm outside that I hadn't noticed. But then I felt it. The air behind me changed, colder, heavier, pressed against my back like a weight, and for a second, I thought I heard breathing. Slow, steady, too close. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, to look, to confirm there was nothing there. But I couldn't. Instead, I focused on the sound of my own breathing, trying to keep it quiet, steady. The lights flickered one more time, then stayed on. The cold air vanished as quickly as it had come. I stood there for a moment, letting my heart settle, and then forced myself to move. At the next enclosure, my hands were trembling so badly I nearly dropped the food tray. I slid it through the slot and stepped back quickly, keeping my eyes fixed on the glass. For the first time, I saw movement. It was subtle, just a shadow shifting near the back of the enclosure, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up my spine. Whatever was inside wasn't small. It wasn't harmless. I tried to shake it off and continue the rounds, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see, I don't even know, someone. By the time I reached the staff room for my break, I was on edge. The room was small and bare, a table, a chair, and a monitor displaying the security camera feeds. I poured myself a cup of stale coffee, hoping it would calm my nerves, and glanced at the monitor. Most of the enclosures were still, the animals either hidden or asleep. But one feed caught my attention. Enclosure 7. The camera showed an empty space, just the plain metal walls of the enclosure. But I knew I'd fed something there. I'd heard it moving. I leaned closer, staring at the screen, and that's when it happened. A shadow. It darted across the frame, too fast for me to make out any details, but big enough to make my stomach drop. I tapped the monitor, hoping it was just a glitch, but the shadow appeared again, closer this time. Then the screen went black. I stumbled back from the monitor, my pulse racing. The rules didn't say anything about what to do if a camera feed went out. Should I check the enclosure? Call Mr. Harland? No. The rules were clear about one thing. Follow them and you'll be fine. I had to trust that. Still, the next round felt different. The halls seemed darker, quieter, like the air itself was waiting for something. As I approached enclosure 7, I noticed the food tray I'd slid in earlier was untouched. The metal slot was slightly ajar, though, like something or someone had tried to open it. I stared at it, my gut screaming at me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. The rules said nothing about skipping enclosures. Carefully, I slid the tray back through and stepped away, my eyes glued to the foggy glass. For a moment, nothing happened. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep enough to rattle the walls. The rules flashed again in my mind. If you hear a growl, hum softly. Hum? That's what they wanted me to do. I hesitated, my mind racing, but the growl came again, louder this time. My throat was dry, but I started to hum. A shaky, uneven melody, the first thing that came to mind. The growling stopped just like that. I stood there, humming, until my voice cracked. Then I backed away slowly, my legs shaking, and made my way to the next enclosure. By the end of the night, I was exhausted mentally, physically, in every possible way. The rules weren't just guidelines. They were survival tactics, each one more unsettling than the last. I sat in my car after my shift, gripping the steering wheel and staring at the building. The job paid well, sure, but was it worth this? As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that the rules weren't just about keeping the animals contained. They were about keeping me alive. I told myself I'd quit after one more night. No paycheck was worth the constant fear, the rules that felt more like riddles, and the sense that this place was alive in ways I couldn't explain. But when I walked through the doors for what I thought would be my final shift, everything felt different. The air was colder, heavier, like the building itself was warning me to turn back. Still, I pushed forward. The sooner I started, the sooner I'd be out of there. The first few rounds were uneventful, almost eerily so. The animals were quiet, the hallways still. I told myself it was a blessing, but deep down I knew better. The calm never lasted. It was during my second round that I noticed something was wrong. The hallway lights flickered again. Longer this time, as if they were struggling against something unseen. I stopped walking, just like the rules said, my breath caught in my throat. The shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, bending and twisting in ways they shouldn't. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, echoing faintly behind me. My heart raced, my body stiff. I knew the rule, don't look behind you. But knowing and doing are two very different things. The footsteps got louder, closer, until they stopped just a few feet away. I could feel something standing there, watching me. I clenched my fists, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I stayed rooted to the spot. And then it spoke, a low, distorted voice, like it was crawling its way through a broken speaker. Why? Are you here? My mind went blank. The rules didn't say anything about this. Leave. The voice hissed, cold and sharp, sending a shiver down my spine. Before it's too late. The lights flickered one last time before stabilizing, and just like that, the presence was gone. I rushed through the rest of the round, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the keyring. By the time I reached the staff room, I felt like I'd been running a marathon. I sat down, my back to the wall, and tried to catch my breath. The security monitor was on, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I didn't want to see whatever was lurking out there. But then I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from the hallway outside the staff room. It wasn't knocking, exactly, more like something sharp dragging against the walls. Tap, tap, scratch. The sound got louder, closer, until it stopped right outside the door. I held my breath, praying it would go away, but then the doorknob rattled. The rules flashed in my mind. Ignore any knocking. But this wasn't knocking. This was worse. The rattling stopped, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then a voice, soft and childlike, came from the other side of the door. Please, help me. My blood ran cold. Let me in, the voice pleaded, trembling like it was barely holding back tears. I wanted to scream, to run, but all I could do was sit there, frozen. My mind raced. It's not real. It's not real. The voice grew louder, more desperate. Please, they're going to hurt me. Tears welled in my eyes. The doorknob rattled again, harder this time, like something was throwing its full weight against the door. And then silence. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, I forced myself to move. My legs felt like jelly as I stood and opened the door, half expecting to see. I don't even know. But the hallway was empty, as if nothing had happened. I convinced myself to finish the shift. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I didn't, whatever was in this place would come after me. By the time I reached the final enclosure, I was running on pure adrenaline. The red door loomed at the end of the hallway, its chipped paint almost glowing under the flickering lights. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. The rule was simple. Never, ever open the red door. But something was different. The air around the door seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising from asphalt. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from behind the door. Come closer. I backed away, my hands trembling. Please, the voice said, soft and sweet. It's safe. Promise. I shook my head, forcing myself to focus on the rule. Never open the door. But then I heard something else. Footsteps. Behind me. They were slow, heavy, and getting closer. I turned to see a shadow stretching down the hallway, long and impossibly thin. My mind raced. If I stayed, whatever was behind me would catch me. But if I opened the door, I didn't have time to think. The footsteps were almost on top of me now, and in a moment of pure panic, I grabbed the handle of the red door and pulled it open. What I saw on the other side, I still can't explain it. The hallway disappeared, replaced by a swirling, endless void. Shadows moved within it, shapes I couldn't understand, their voices echoing in my head. Why did you open it? One of them hissed. I stumbled back, but it was too late. The door slammed shut on its own, and the lights in the hallway went out completely. For the first time since I started this job, I broke the rules, and I knew I wouldn't make it out unscathed. I don't remember how I got out of that hallway. One moment, I was standing in front of the red door, staring into that endless void, and the next, I was outside, gasping for air under the flickering light of the building's entrance. My hands were trembling, my knees weak, but somehow, I was alive. The door had shut itself behind me, sealing away whatever was on the other side. I didn't look back. Couldn't. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The rules, the whispers, the shadows. I couldn't tell if it had been real or some kind of twisted nightmare. But then I looked down at my hand. There was a mark there, faint but unmistakable. A jagged black line, almost like a burn, running across my palm where I'd touched the handle of the red door. It stung when I pressed it, as if it were alive. I didn't stay to ask questions. I drove home, my heart pounding the entire way, half expecting something to follow me. Every shadow on the road seemed to stretch toward me, every sound magnified in the silence of the night. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was drenched in sweat. My grip on the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. The next day, I quit. I didn't go back to the facility, didn't call to explain. I just left the keys and the notebook in a box outside the front gate and walked away. But leaving the job didn't mean leaving the experience behind. Every night since, I've heard the whispers, faint at first, like a breeze slipping through a crack in the window, but they've grown louder, closer. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that void again. The shadows, the shapes, the endless nothingness staring back at me. And then there's the mark. It hasn't faded. If anything, it's gotten darker, the edges spreading like veins under my skin. I don't know what it means, but I can feel it pulsing. I've tried to tell myself it's all in my head, that I'm just imagining things. But deep down, I know the truth. That door wasn't meant to be opened. And whatever I let out, it hasn't finished with me yet. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I wonder, what would have happened if I had just followed the rules? But it's too late for that now. All I can do is wait. For what? I don't know. But it's coming. Subscribe for more horror stories every day.